So we're working with very modern ways last week and this week that the teachings of the Bodhisattva path can be misunderstood and misapplied. That's not to say that these didn't exist in ancient times, but the readings and ideas coming forth from last week and this week are really coming from modern thinkers, such as the authors of Radical Dharma, such as my own book, such as the work of Buddhist psychotherapist John Wellwood, which we'll get into a little bit tonight. So we're going to talk about the wonderful and confusing topic of how to work with spiritual bypassing. But we'll start with the period of meditation and Tonglen, where we focus on the more ultimate bodhicitta qualities and elements of Tonglen practice. So I'll invite you to get in your meditation seat. And at your own pace, for the first 5 or so minutes, we'll work with the steps of shamatha, checking in. Taking your seat, checking in, and mindfulness of breath and awareness of thoughts. And then we'll move into the 4 steps of Tonglen briefly after that, with an emphasis on the more ultimate bodhicitta level of Tonglen practice. And now I'm just going to invite you as we move into a brief Tonglen session. Sometimes we tune into the heart center as this energetic space of both caring and warmth, but also non-attachment. Today I'm going to invite you to raise your gaze to the horizon. So you're looking straight ahead and with a very broad sense of peripheral awareness. So you can place your gaze to have just a touch of anchoring on some point of reference or object in front of you. But the quality is actually to bring our awareness into a much larger perceptual space. So that it becomes harder for us to focus, you could say, or fixate on any one point of reference. And as another way to let go of a singular point of reference, let's just see if we can not have a technique for a few minutes. You could say, well, what do I do about my thoughts? All we have to do is let them arise, let them dwell, and let them fade or transform or dissolve on their own. We're just working with ultimate bodhicitta as what is often called a formless meditation. And then out of this space of vastness, we can start to move into the second step of Tonglen. So working with textures. But again, take a moment to establish that your body, your being is also spacious, vast like the sky. And so that when you breathe in the texture of pollution or suffering, toxin, there's really no place for any of that to land. And when you breathe out, it's just light, sky. In a sense, you're just allowing the cycling of pollution and light to happen. Nothing really to do from an ultimate bodhicitta standpoint. And now we'll move into Tonglen for ourselves, for yourself. Third phase. So can you breathe in from the space of vast sky-like mind, whatever your current dilemma might be. And as you breathe out, you can send light or other healing energy or thoughts to yourself. But you could also send yourself a reminder of impermanence, that suffering is impermanent. Or a reminder of emptiness. Breathing in the suffering and breathing out, perhaps a reminder to just let go, if that is helpful. Breathing in the suffering, breathing out a sense of opening, letting go of whatever we might be holding on to. Then I'm going to invite you to see if, without working with other individuals, you can begin to expand your awareness, your perceptual field, your practice of Tonglen, to breathing in the confusion or suffering of sentient beings, and breathing out our wish that they are free from suffering. Can we just tune into this quality in vastness of all beings? All beings want to be free of suffering. And obviously, if specific beings come to mind, please allow that to happen. But can we also tune in to something that's larger than the individual, more universal, than just a interpersonal space. So doing Tonglen for as many sentient beings as we can, perhaps all beings. See what that feels like to even attempt. And when you feel ready, you can just return to that space of openness, perceptually, perhaps raising the gaze again, having a sense of the space behind your body, the space below your body, the vastness above the crown of your head. Back to openness. Just letting what arises arise and letting it dwell and letting it change or cease as it does. You did it. If you haven't listened to or watched or weren't present at last Tuesday's recordings, that will be confusing. But now you have something to look forward to as you go back over the material. So, on the one hand, tonight's topic is this as an examination of this phrase that was coined about 30 or 35, I think, years ago at this point by the now passed Buddhist psychotherapist John Welwood, called spiritual bypassing. But also from a kind of philosophical and Dharma standpoint, it's to take one step deeper into looking at the relationship between relative and ultimate truth. And from a practice standpoint, it's to look at how relative and ultimate truth inform our Tonglen meditation. And from a life standpoint, it's to begin an exploration of what's the benefit of relative and ultimate truth when we actually have to figure out what to do, how to be, how to move through the world as a bodhisattva in training. So I think if you take, as we started in our first course with the Four Noble Truths, the teachings on karma, the teachings on ethics, sort of the teachings on suffering for sure. If you take the view that why do we come to the path? Well, I don't want to generalize for all of you because I've learned we each really have our own time and reasons for coming to the path that are very personal. Sometimes there's interpersonal or social elements that inform the beginning of our path. But from that personal level, we each come to the path, I think, first to try to understand how relative truth works. How do I work, and how do I work in relationship to others? And where do I run into problems with my relationship to myself and my relationship to others? Relative truth, we kind of want to figure out how things work. You know how on YouTube now there's like a tutorial for anything you want to do? There are even YouTube tutorials for the Japanese Zen style of eating that's used in some meditation retreats in the Zen tradition and the Shambhala tradition called oryoki. Right? So you could learn how to do the eating practice on a silent meditation retreat on YouTube. You know, I think that's pretty cool. And we want to learn how our emotions work. Right? So I think in a lot of ways, rain is a very relative truth practice. Like, what do I do about this grief or about this anger or about this shame? How do I learn its causes? How do I learn its, how the different Lego pieces of it fit together? And so I think in a sense, you could say that relative truth has some, if we're going to be really honest about how we enter all this, relative truth has some primacy. And thankfully, there are teachings that start to try to piece together not just how specific tutorials work, like how shamatha works as opposed to loving kindness meditation, as opposed to mantra practice, as opposed to Tonglen. But there are teachings that start to piece together the universal qualities that are present across patterns of experience, right? So for example, we're trying to work with thought, and somebody says, some Buddhist elder or just smart person says, all thoughts are impermanent. Which is true, right? Has anybody ever thought a permanent thought? No. You couldn't even use the past tense. There wouldn't even be a tense. We might have highly redundant or repetitive cycles of thought, but this thought that's arising now is impermanent. And that's a good bit of information to have no matter what the arising thought is, right? So ultimate truth begins to globalize experience beyond the specificity of one or another YouTube tutorial. It's like no matter what you're trying to learn to do, this is true. So there's no solid self. That's another ultimate truth. So you start sort of trying to figure out how these two levels go together, right? In other words, the level where things are true no matter what is happening, and the level where a very specific set of relationships or a very specific set of causes and conditions, like the chopsticks and the bowls and napkins and cloths and spoon of oryoki practice, specifically fit together, right? We're trying to kind of figure out both at the same time. It sets up this interesting dynamic between what is universally true and what is specifically true. Now, obviously, there's an apparent hierarchy here between ultimate and relative truth. First of all, when you call something ultimate or absolute, it kind of seems better, right? Sort of like top shelf truth, so to speak, trophy truth. Does anybody not feel that way, that the sort of the terms kind of set up this apparent hierarchy, that what we're going for is the ultimate truth? And so there could be this sort of, this is also exacerbated in Buddhist thought because of the Sanskrit and Tibetan term for relative truth, samvriti satya. Samvriti is one of these I'd like to buy a vowel transliterated words. That's the way I've seen it spelled, samvriti, and then satya is truth. Literally, samvriti means something like concealed truth. So sometimes relative truth gets treated as the truth of appearances, right? Like, for example, this seems like a coffee mug, which I now have filled with water. It seems like a solid, permanent entity, but it's impermanent. It's also made up of many different parts. So it could be deconstructed and be a bunch of metallic atoms. And it's also dependent on, and this is the more mind-only perspective that we studied, my perception of it as a coffee mug. Right? So it's not as solid as it seems. It's not as independent or lasting as it seems. It's an appearance. Right? So you could think of relative truth, and in sometimes classic Buddhism, it's thought of as sort of just the way things are appearing to be from a more superficial standpoint. But what it really is a series of atoms, which are themselves space and energy, right? And so it's really empty. And so we could say, which of these is more important to know if we want to reduce suffering for self and others? And this is 2,000 years of Buddhist philosophy that I'm shorthanding here. Is it more important to know that it's a coffee mug and how to skillfully and effectively use a coffee mug? Or is it more important to know that it's a non-solid, impermanent object of consciousness that is based on me conceptualizing it for it to have its sense of being. So, because the ultimate truth often feels like the deeper truth about something, there's a moment, I don't know if I mean, I know there's a lot of people who've already heard about these concepts of ultimate truth before, and we've talked about it a little bit, obviously. So maybe that wasn't such a big deal, but maybe the first moment you heard, oh, the coffee mug is just a bunch of atoms. Was there like a whoa moment? Did anybody have a whoa moment the first time you really looked at appearances or relative reality as being a little bit more superficial, like one of those matrix moments? So it can feel like that is the deeper truth, right? The deeper level of this is that it's impermanent, that it's non-solid, that I'm only giving it a reality by perceiving it a certain way. And it's really just space and energy, right? That feels like a deeper truth than here's what it's useful for, right? Oh, by the way, the water in it can keep us alive, right? Oh, by the way, some people don't have water right now. You know, all of these things feel like, yeah. Let's get back to the space and energy discussion, right? And you start to see, and I don't know if you've experienced this, but you start to see this teasing apart of ultimate truth from relative truth. And it feels like one is more important than the other, rather than them being two important aspects of the same experience. Is what I'm saying making sense? Because this teasing apart of, right, so in Zen we call the preference for ultimate truth Zen sickness or emptiness sickness. Chogyam Trungpa actually had a phrase for this too. He called it shunyata, right? I think we all know what shunyata means if you're geeky enough. But this is the main Sanskrit word for emptiness, or really empty of, lacking solid characteristics, and yet still manifesting. So Chogyam Trungpa called this shunyata poisoning, where ultimate truth becomes more important than relative truth. The deeper layer of this being space and energy become more important than how do I relate with the coffee mug in a skillful and compassionate way for both self and others. And so that's the way in various bodies of his work. I quoted him in The Road Home from his book Toward a Psychology of Awakening, and we had as one of our readings for this week a interview that John Wellwood did, and spiritual bypassing is also mentioned in Radical Dharma. So what John Wellwood said is that in spiritual bypassing, we try to move beyond our psychological and emotional issues by sidestepping them, and that's dangerous. It sets up a debilitating split between the Buddha and the human within us. That's super crucial. And it leads to a conceptual one kind of spirituality where one pole of life is elevated at the expense of its opposite. Absolute truth is favored over relative truth, the impersonal over the personal, emptiness over form, transcendence over embodiment, and detachment over feeling. One might, for example, try to practice non-attachment by dismissing one's need for love, but this only drives the need underground so that it often becomes unconsciously acted out in covert and possibly harmful ways instead. I think that's just a really wonderful quote, right? So it's really important, and you can study this. We've already studied, and I've already annoyed some of you, I know, by studying one of the Buddhist philosophical tenet systems, um, the mind-only system, the Yogacara system. I also know that book blew some of our minds. And I don't know if it was the more ultimate truth aspect of the Yogacara teachings that blew our minds or the relative truth aspect, right? But there's always, in any of these philosophical systems you can study, and I can provide some geek readings. In Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, there's 4 main philosophical tenet systems, and the mind-only system, and the one called Madhyamika, which is emptiness philosophy, which we're going to get into more, especially when Dr. Shante Smalls gives us a guest lecture in 2 weeks. These different tenet systems all have a toggling back and forth and a distinction between the aspects of their teachings that are more relative truth. How does reality appear? How do relationships between phenomenon function? And the more ultimate truth. How do they actually abide? And what are their universal qualities that we can recognize and begin to spot no matter what specific phenomenon is arising right now? So it sets up this quality that I think is really part of the Bodhisattva path that I like to call, and I would like you to remember this verb, the toggle. Toggle. Everybody know what a toggle switch is? It's a sense of going back and forth between 2 types of experience, you know. We do this in all kinds of ways as practitioners, you know, like the first party you go to or dinner party you go to after a silent meditation retreat. Oh boy, is that a toggle, you know. You're deep within your own reflection, and then you have to go be social with all the social norms of whatever environment you inhabit. And there's a switching back and forth. But here we're talking about this toggle between the relative and ultimate truths. Sorry, Ernesto, the word in English is toggle with an O. Right? And we're constantly like, just that experience of me saying, okay, this is a cup of coffee. This is a cup of water in a coffee mug that can hydrate me. If it were coffee, it could potentially caffeinate me, right? And this is space and energy, right? Those seem to be 2 different layers of the same experience, right? In Tonglen, we might feel it, and I intentionally tried to lead us through a very ultimate truth biased or focused version of Tonglen. You know, I wasn't talking about the specific relationships. I was talking about the quality of tuning into that which is universal or ultimate. Right? But Tonglen has this toggle. You start with openness and feeling your heart, and then you start working with this specific texture. And even that has a certain toggle, right, between suffering and release from suffering. And then you go into specific beings, and then you try to lead back into this quality of warm, non-attached openness from the heart mind, from the heart center. So much of the path of awakening is this sort of what is universally true and then what is true right now about this set of phenomena, this set of beings, myself and the people that I'm working with. And we could see very easily that if it were possible to somehow find a way to transcend the suffering experience by just focusing on the ultimate truth, that would be the way to go, wouldn't it? Like if you could just say, when you get your next credit card bill or student loan debt, these are just numbers on a page. They are empty. They are symbolic. This is not a solid actual experience. This is a concept that I and Visa are applying to a fundamentally empty reality. If that solved the situation, if that made the pain of the situation go away, I would certainly choose that anytime. And that's actually coming from a friend who reported, as I was talking to friends writing the chapter in my book on spiritual bypassing and emptiness, a friend reported that when he was studying emptiness, I believe he went to Naropa, the Buddhist University in Boulder, Colorado, and he said he was studying emptiness in college, and it just he completely missed the point, and it got him into credit card debt because he took that approach of like, I don't have to open this envelope. These are just numbers on a page. It's all impermanent. We're all going to die anyway, right? So he used it to try to transcend the relative truth of his situation, right? So we could use this to avoid psychological spots or life spots of accountability. And that's, Wellwood keeps this very personal. We could also use privileging of the ultimate truth to avoid an awareness of a privileged location, right, in our world. And I've definitely noticed this as well in my social media presence, which I keep using, boring you all with as an example with, but that it is often when there is a Dharma discussion online about the relative truths of our society and who is supported, who is oppressed, who is in what location, how that works, it is often those with more relative privilege who tend to use arguments of ultimate truth to try to, at best, equalize, perhaps to try to include everybody, because that's what ultimate truth does. But it also seems to dismiss the importance of the relative truths of suffering being discussed. I don't know, has anybody ever seen a person seeming to engage in teachings like impermanence or all sentient beings want to be happy, or these concepts are just empty anyway? Yep, all lives matter is the best example of. I don't think the person who came up with that was a Buddhist per se, but you could easily see a misinterpretation of something the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh saying, perhaps at first with good intention, but sort of equating types of suffering that are not actually on the relative level, inhabiting the same realms or with the same relative structures influencing them, right? I also see this in the it's all good, yeah, which is not the same thing as basic goodness. It's all good has this sort of dismissive quality, a lot of times. I mean, maybe you say it's all good with a really engaged way of being in the world, but a lot of times when we say it's all good, it's like, don't shut up. It has a kind of passive aggressive quality sometimes. I don't know if you have experienced it that way in yourself or others. So yeah, there's this real interest, I think, both on a personal level and on a more social level of the Bodhisattva path of saying, how do we use ultimate truth to dismiss relative truth? And that's why I want to talk about the toggle, because the reason we work with ultimate and relative truth from an experiential standpoint and from a Buddhist philosophical standpoint is because we start to realize that the way things appear on their surface and their deeper qualities do often seem to be at odds with each other, right? The level at which the coffee mug is a useful tool for consumption and the level at which it is space and energy on a subatomic level, those seem at odds with each other at first, right? So we work with how can both be true, right? How can both be true? And so there's a toggling back and forth between the space and energy level and the specific relational level. And that's in the bodhicitta practices. It's built into the arc of Tonglen practice. If we want to be overly simplistic about it, steps 1 and 4 of Tonglen are more ultimate bodhicitta, and steps 2 and 3 are more relative bodhicitta. But there's a swing back and forth. And so we do that because we want to figure out this conundrum, like, how can all beings want happiness and then still specific oppressions or specific confusions or specific psychological or spiritual wounds occur, right? How can this be both a coffee mug and space and energy, you know? Because we start to realize that if we overemphasize relative truth, we fixate, you know? No, this is my coffee mug. What happens when I lose it if we only emphasize relative truth? No awareness of impermanence, no awareness of non-solidity. So ultimate truth, if I had to say it in a word, why we need to toggle into ultimate truth is we all need to practice letting go of fixation. And our fixation is both object-based and it's also concept-based. We fixate on concepts about reality that minimize our ability to really be. And also from a compassion standpoint, this fixation creates barriers between self and other that stop us from being able to connect and care. So the practice of tuning into ultimate truth is the practice of letting go of fixation. Object fixation and concept fixation. The practice of engaging with relative reality as a practitioner. Getting into that relational space where you're like, you know what? I really hate myself today, but I'm going to wish myself just a little kindness. I'm going to work with that discomfort. I'm going to work with this person who's irritating me. I'm going to work with the person I know who's sick. The same relative practices that say, you know, the bodhisattva does their dishes and makes their bed. There's a quality of engagement that, because if we let go too much, if we disengage, if we detach too much, we become dismissive towards our actual life and our actual world. So ultimate truth solves the problem of fixation by helping us practice letting go. Relative truth solves the problem of being too dismissive, too detached, by engaging. And it feels like a toggle. And this is what a lot of the Bodhisattva path is moving from a recognition that we're bypassing one of those levels, we're avoiding one of those levels, to I'm going to start to try to tune into both. And I may have to go back and forth a little bit to do that. And then eventually there's a blending. There's a blending of a kind of vast heart space. A kind of openness that can allow anything to arise in one's experience. A kind of total accommodation. And I do think when you meet people who really have awakened qualities, there's some real sense of letting be and letting go, not holding on. Which really frees up a lot of energy. Because think about how much energy in our mind-body systems is spent in tension with reality, holding, like, I need this idea to be real, And so there's really a quality of not holding on, but at the same time, there's a real precision. Thich Nhat Hanh, who we are reading, especially with his teachings on the Heart Sutra and the Madhyamika or Middle Way school of emptiness, that those teachings are related to. So he clearly knows emptiness. But I saw him give here at the store and community space in New York, ABC Home, he gave a calligraphy demonstration, which was so precise in the way he moved through space. Made me, just even watching, not even doing anything, just made me feel completely clumsy on the relative level of reality. Just watching how he took tea from his thermos into his cup, drank it, as if performing that action with precision, the relationship between him and the teacup, the real existence of the teacup as a something to be so present with, so in relationship with, was everything. And then to take the brush and make calligraphy, it was so precise. And this is the person who's also talking about all phenomena are completely empty of apparent existence. And every concept that we overlay onto phenomenon is empty and subjective. And then at the same time, to be that precise, it was really humbling to watch. But you could see, if I said, coming out of that, I got to get more precise in the way I drink tea, and got more tense about the relative truth of taking my coffee or my tea, that it could actually lead to more suffering, So the blending happens because we start to realize not that relative and ultimate truth are opposed to each other, but that they actually complement each other. The more we relax, the more we can tune in. The more we allow, the more we can influence. And maybe I'll close, and then we'll lead into our breakout rooms for about 20 minutes. And then my guess is we'll have a lively discussion as we think about our own tendencies to bypass or fixate, on the other hand, on relative truth. One time when the great Tibetan master, although he was actually from India and spent much of his time in what I believe is now Afghanistan, Padmasambhava, the real founder of Tibetan Buddhism, was once asked what it's like to be enlightened. you know? And he said, not shying away from the question, which is pretty badass, he said, my mind is as vast as the sky, yet my actions are as fine as a grain of sand. And think about the toggle. There's a toggle involved in just actually being able, in my mind, to even visualize those two visual metaphors together. You may have heard, if you've studied any of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, you may have heard another version of the story. My mind is as vast as the sky, yet my actions are as fine as a sesame seed. And that's the Kagyu version of the story, because one of the early masters of the Kagyu tradition, Tilopa, supposedly got enlightened while beating sesame seeds into sesame oil. You can get enlightened making tahini. I think I've already maybe said that before. But just think about that union of spacious, letting go, vastness, and precision. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about how to both be into the non-conceptual, energetic level of our present experience, and also be right there on the relative spot to know exactly how to use a coffee mug for the benefit of self and others. So I think that's all I have to say. It's good because I think I want to leave a little bit more time for discussion. Yeah, his name was Padmasambhava. He's considered really the founder of Tibetan Buddhism. Padma means lotus, and Sambhava means emerging from or born from. So he's sometimes referred to as the lotus born. My mind is as vast as the sky, yet my actions are as fine as a grain of sand. So we'll move into our breakout space with the following 3 questions. And the 3 questions for your consideration in either the breakout rooms or on your own contemplation during the next, let's say, 18 to 20 minutes. Why is Buddhist philosophy important to study? Is there any way to increase the relevance or interest for you? What is your experience? And you may want to start with the second question because it might feel very prominent in your mind right now. What is your experience of this toggle between relative and ultimate that Ethan talked about? And third, how can we stop or at least work with spiritual bypassing, both as individuals and as sanghas or communities? Okay, so we'll move into our breakout space or into our journaling and contemplation space with those questions in mind. Okay. So just want to say a few more things before we open it up to some large group discussion or questions or insights from you all for about 20 minutes, or a few more things. One is, I think there's an intelligence also, and as we move towards the Mahayana and especially the Vajrayana, we're always looking for the seeds of wisdom, even in our most confused patterns. And there is an intelligence towards using ultimate truth to sometimes shield the intensity of a relative manifestation, right? And that's actually what it's ultimate truth is meant to actually make us able to accommodate more. And if that sometimes starts with a little bit of avoidance of that which we are not ready to become completely aware of along the path, I think that's a good thing, as long as we have the Bodhisattva's intention to eventually awaken completely. And I also think we have to recognize that we do bypass, and I think in some ways this tradition is based on a man who bypassed his life in the world to go seek ultimate truth, right? So the Buddha had spiritual bypassing pretty badly. And you turn that into a slow awakening experience. So that's why I tried to present this sort of progression of going from noticing what we're avoiding or what we're dismissing or bypassing to next toggling back and forth between relative and ultimate truth reminders in both practice and life, and to finally a state of awakening, which is this quality of integration or blending or unifying relative and ultimate truth into something that is both open and accommodating, and at the same time very precise in how it's engaging in experience and engaging in systems to reduce suffering and bring about more awareness. So I think it's a very natural progression and a very beautiful progression from bypassing to toggling to blending or integrating. So that's all I wanted to say. What's on everyone's mind in terms of this question of spiritual bypassing or misunderstanding ultimate truth? What's on anyone's mind?
I can go with something.
Please.
I was thinking about just what you mentioned about systems, and I was thinking about the role or the notion of interdependence in trying to accommodate both relative and ultimate truth, and how even when you mention the possibility to dismiss the importance of relative truth in suffering or in specific situations where there are sort of more vulnerability in some way, or where you are dismissing your privileged location, you can go back and forth to take a more open or bigger systems perspective, and then go back to a specific situation. So I'm thinking that for me it's helpful to kind of take the notion of interdependence in trying to hold both sides of the thing.
Yes. So I think in terms of the way I wrote, thank you so much for that, Ernesto, and I totally agree. And just to clarify, interdependence means a lot of different things. On one level, you could say that relative truth is where interdependence happens, right? Where we're studying how phenomenon or beings relate to each other or affect each other in a network, right? How the parts of the body interdepend on each other, how the parts of a nature system interdepend. Watch the documentary this weekend, the Ice on Fire. It's the new HBO documentary, and had more understanding about how climate change and the climate crisis is related to this interdependent cycling of carbon and how to balance that out, right? So that's a relative truth on one level. On another level, you could say there's an interdependence between relative and ultimate truth, right? That they depend on each other because they're defined in relationship to each other as sort of two sides of the same coin. So you could say that as well. I think the clarification that's important to me is when people in spiritual circles use the term dualistic, they sometimes, I would say, misunderstand that. So when we're saying non-dualistic, we're not saying that there aren't multiple elements of a certain causal situation. We're saying dualistic, as I understand it as being useful, is when we think that things that are actually interdependent with each other are actually separate from each other, right? So dualistic is the notion, for example, just because it's an easy binary in the American world, and there aren't that many easy binaries, like Republicans are over here, Democrats are over here, right? And that could be a kind of dualistic split, right? And so the ultimate truth, the non-dualistic reminder, could come along and say, actually, you all live on the same land, right? So it's not that dualistic, right? But my understanding is dualism only refers to when you're conceptually splitting things that are actually, and separating out things that are actually interdependent with each other. Naming that they have different locations or different identities or different beliefs, that's not duality. It's when you're distinguishing and then separating or isolating that which is actually part of a complete system, right? And there's also the problem there in spiritual bypassing. I think one of the problems that I've seen a lot, especially in the modern space, is what I would call false equivalence, right? Which is something I've mentioned before, which is where, because all relative truth share a certain qualities, right? Like all beings want to be happy, right? You over apply that notion of the shared qualities of all beings to say they must be equal, right? You know, so what one person says is equal to what another person says, right? What an expert says is equal to what a novice says, right? And on some level, that's true because they each have a voice, right? But it gets interesting when you say, you know, like a billionaire just wants to be happy, just like a homeless person, right? It's like, okay, but there's some false equivalence in that, right? There's some privileging of that which is shared universally to like not really look at the specific interdependent causes and conditions. So I think that's another way that spiritual bypassing works in our current paradigm, is kind of making things equal that actually have very specific relational locations. So yeah, but I think this notion of interdependence is really important because it has multiple meanings, as does duality and non-duality. So thank you. Someone else, please jump in. Maybe I'll just say something to, oh wait, I see a question just came in. Why are we more prone to get fixated on relative truth over absolute truth? So maybe I misspoke there. I was saying that overemphasis on relative truth manifests as a fixation in specific objects or concepts as if they are solid, permanent, and independent, right? So I don't think we're prone to get more fixated on relative truth. Maybe some of us are, for sure. But that the manifestation of a kind of overemphasizing of relative truth is a fixation on the specific aspects of an experience rather than emphasizing the universal aspects of that experience. So I think spiritual bypassing is when we get fixated on absolute truth, basically. So I didn't mean to. You can get fixated on either, but with relative truth, there's a fixation on some specific identity. And I think from that standpoint, what we talked about last week, Carol and others, idiot compassion is often a more relative truth problem because we get fixated on the identity of being seen as a bodhisattva, you know, and having to be known as a helpful, compassionate being. So that creates one type of problem. And I think the spiritual bypass creates the problem of a kind of fixation on non-attachment. Not my problem. Just let it be. You know? So I hope that clarifies, Carol.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Dorian.
Hi. I can't see anybody. I don't know what happened, but
I can,
I
I can see you and I can hear you.
okay. I missed the breakout session because I had to plug my computer back in, but I was catching up a bit. So, do you have any maybe shortcut advice, or does anyone have had has anyone had this experience? I've noticed that I do have a pattern to run away from, you could say, relative truth in a moment. I'm sensing threats, maybe I'm sensing maybe competition or some of the lesser attractive human traits. And I will go right away to, you could say, Dharma, but actually it's, it's really almost like disassociation or something, but it's my little private, glass, my little glass tower,
Mm-hmm.
fragile turret or something where I not feel above everyone, but it's a place of protection, but it's also where I feel that I'm connecting to something higher that's protecting me.
Mm-hmm.
And so this toggling, I really relate to a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a concern because there are times where I really want to stay up there, want to stay up there in that metaphorical or literal, tower. And it can feel, you can really become isolated.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then when you come back into the world of beings, it can be overstimulating, and perhaps you can become extremely excited. So it almost seems very, you understand.
I do.
Any shortcut to bring, any advice?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really do. I approach all of this stuff from a Mahayana and Tantric perspective, which means we look for the wisdom first, And what I'm reminded that there's a beautiful analogy of a kind of prison that we can create for ourselves, which the teachings on emptiness are meant to remind us of. And I love this visual of creating a prison where all of the walls of the prison are Dharma books.
Wow.
Right. So think about that, sort of like you're using what could liberate you to actually sort of imprison you. But if we start from this view, and I think this is really important to start from the view of like, how is wisdom manifest even when we act from a confused perspective? Like one phrase, to use it in the Shambhala terminology, sometimes a question I like to ask, even when I feel like I'm engaging in my karmic cycle again, so to speak, my tiramisu cycle, as you all have come to know it as, is what is basic goodness trying to do here? The other way of saying that in a more classic Dharmic sense is like, what is bodhicitta trying to do here, right? And that retreat into what you're calling the tower, to me, it's like, well, maybe it's really hard to engage in difficult situations, and maybe there are situations that cause fear or that have hurt us in the past, right? So maybe that, and to think about that, like even the person's spiritual bypassing, when discussing Dharma concepts on some online blog or Facebook or whatever, they're trying to protect themselves from hurt, because relative truth has hurt, and they don't want to have to address it, And so part of you can feel great compassion for yourself or for someone else if you just say, oh, I isolate because it hurts. And then perhaps that isolation can be like a preparation, I mean, Tonglen is an isolation practice. You can do it with other people, but it's a way of, has anybody like thought about this, that like, Oh, really? And maybe some of your friends in the world who diss Buddhism or diss meditation as navel gazing have said this to you, like, wait, you're going to go into a secluded space to practice compassion? Why not just go help somebody? Why not just help yourself? Has anybody had this conversation, with anyone, with yourself? And so I think if you view it as I need to isolate to prepare to retreat, then that can shift the experience. And that's, I think it's really important to view the wisdom behind a bypass is I'm not ready right now, but let me set an intention, But the other part of the teachings on emptiness is we are trying to actually learn, and this is what's brilliant, and I think when we get to the Heart Sutra, this will become more manifest. We're trying to learn the tricks that we play using conceptual reality to actually stay confused. And you can even use Buddhism to stay confused. That's pretty clear, right? You can use Buddhism to stay confused. And so you can use ultimate truth to stay confused. And so that's the notion of really recognizing spiritual bypassing. And obviously my guess is that Dr. Wellwood coined this phrase because he was working with these ultimate truth teachings, but when people would come to him for therapy, it's a more interpersonal space, and you get into like, what's going on? Where are you stuck? Where are you suffering? Where are you struggling? And he maybe noticed their tendency to isolate away from actually like what's going on in life, to toggle back into like the Dharma as this way to not have to deal with the pain of life, And it's not like I made this joke once that perhaps they should call Buddhist meditation non-transcendental meditation, because we're really trying to engage. But at the same time, the paramitas, which we're going to study next week and in week 7 and 8 of this course, are sometimes called the transcendental virtues, right? So the transcendental practices. So that's the other thing is like, if a bypass could work, take it, The problem is it doesn't actually work because you end up bringing your stuff with you. That's why the bypass doesn't work. So eventually you have to face it. But it might make sense to isolate for a moment. And meditation practice is a skillful isolation. And as long as we're clear about why we're doing it and how we might be, as long as we grow increasingly clear with a sense of humor, which I think is crucial, about the ways we might be deceiving ourselves, it's okay to take a little time. And sometimes you want to give yourself a wall of comfort books or Dharma books to just say, I'm just gonna isolate and go in. You just need a door out of that room. You don't want it to turn into a prison, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. We have time for one more before a brief closing meditation. Anybody who's holding back or needed an extra minute to just formulate your thoughts or your insights or your experience? Okay, I see one from Dan. I really enjoyed Wellwood's description of Sangha community's tendencies to parrot Dharma teachings instead of keeping it real. This has been my experience quite a bit, where it can be difficult to have real conversations with people sometimes. Yeah. And Dan, I believe you mean specifically difficult to have real conversations with people in Dharma communities because they use certain language that's kind of avoidant, right? Right. Yeah, this has been a big conversation for those of us who have experienced a lot of pain and sadness with what's happening in the Shambhala community. Sometimes mass communications about what's happened feel like they use sort of a dharmic language, but it's like what's actually being said. And I've heard that from other communities as well. And I think that's another way that we can actually toggle in the language that we choose, is whenever we choose to use Dharma language, to actually bring it back to specific examples or experiences so that it doesn't just float out there into vagueness. I think that's a good practice of right speech, actually, is when you talk about emptiness, or you talk about basic goodness, or you talk about being heartbroken by the suffering in the Sangha, that you link it back to some specificity, because I think the language can be very evocative and opening, and it's good to have Dharma language, but then it has to tie back to specific experience. And I think we have to be unafraid of being, as the Zen folks like to say, we've been using their 4 great vows chant, and we'll use it again at the end of tonight, intimate, right? So whatever ultimate truth teachings we use, they're meant to make us more intimate with relative truth. And I think we can practice that by, in the way we talk about these teachings, toggling back and forth between ultimate ideas and specificity in our own experience. Because I really try to do that. I don't always succeed in my own conversations, etc. But I think that is what makes the Dharma relevant and accessible, is when the ultimate truth ties back into real world experience. So it's a great, what you're bringing up is a great reminder and great aspiration. And the only other thing I'll say is we change a culture by the way we manifest in it. So don't be afraid to, if you're in a Sangha where that's happening, to speak differently. And individuals have a bigger influence than we think, I think. We can't change whole systems, but we can influence. Yeah. So, and if you ever catch me being too vague and not linking it back to specific examples, which are just good from a pedagogical standpoint too, please remind me to not become too dualistic about my ultimate truth language in leading these courses together. Yeah. Tony, for those of us in NYC, Tony is giving a shout out about Pride Week this week, which is also Pride Month. 4 million people are visiting the city from all over the world to celebrate. This is the 50th anniversary this year of Stonewall. Is that correct? I believe that's true. I just forget math and forget what year it is now. It's 2019, right? So yeah, 50th anniversary. So those of you in New York, that probably means it's going to be a pretty awesome weekend. I think it's supposed to be hot for the rest of this week as well. And that's another, right? So you can imagine somebody saying, what does it matter? You're straight, you're queer, you're white, you're black, you're indigenous, you're of color, you're a man, you're male-bodied, you're woman-bodied. What does it matter? All beings want happiness. Identity is empty anyway, you know? Why engage in identity politics, which is a very dismissive term, by the way. The term identity politics itself is a very dismissive term of relative truth. It's a spiritual bypass. Yeah. So thank you all so much. Why don't we just close? I guess I want us to close by coming back to the relative truth, because that's where it all lands. And I'm just going to invite us into a 4-minute practice of taking 1 minute to breathe, and then the next 3 minutes to just do Tonglen for yourself. And perhaps if you need a prompt when you get to Tonglen for yourself, we could think of a way that we in our past or present feel like we've engaged in a spiritual bypass. And when you breathe in, you can just breathe in the confusion or the honest desire to stay safe, and breathe out a wish to yourself for liberation from bypassing. So we'll just practice together for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll close with the 4 great vows of Zen, along with the 7-day meditation vow. So we'll move straight, for those of us who'd like to recommit to regular practice, into the 7-day meditation vow, and then we'll all close together, reaffirming the spirit of the Bodhisattva with the 4 great vows of Zen. I, Ethan, with confidence in the benefits of a regular practice of sitting meditation, do hereby commit for myself and no one else to practicing at least 1 session of sitting meditation for as short or as long a period of time as I am willing and able for each of the next 7 days. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. The dharmas are boundless. I vow to master them. The Buddha way is unattainable. I vow to attain it. Thank you all so much. We'll have our gathering this Saturday as well. And then next week we do have our Tuesday class, which I'll be leading. There's it says guest lecture on the syllabus, but I'll be leading it. And we'll go into the Bodhicharyavatara a little bit, the first two paramitas, and also be inviting us to do a little bit more textual study of a classic Dharma text, and even going to invite you next week to practice memorizing a stanza in translation from the Bodhicharyavatara, which is an interesting contemplative practice in its own right. So I hope you all have a wonderful week. Good luck with practice, and good luck with difficult people, especially ourselves. Good night.